Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of a five-part series on the Jeongdong Heroes podcast. I'm your host, Alex. A lot of you may know some general information of Korean history and culture, but here on the Jeongdong Heroes podcast, we're going to dive a bit deeper into Jeongdong and what it's all about, the historical people, the events related, and each episode we're going to be inviting a very special guest with a theme relevant to Jeongdong. For today's episode, we have a very special guest all the way from Canada who will be discussing about a person who played a huge role in the fight for independence of Korea. And this all took place in the heart of Jeongdong. So without further ado, we're going to introduce our first guest, Andrew Lim. Welcome.
Yes, it's an honor to be here, actually. It's great to talk about Frank Schofield because he is one of the most recognized and, I guess, prestigious heroes of Canada. And obviously, as a Canadian here in Korea, Frank Schofield has done a lot for Korea. So, I mean, it's actually my honor to be here. Thank you for choosing me.
Yeah, of course.
So I'll introduce myself. My name is Andrew Lim. I currently work for the Canadian government, or to be more specific, I work for the government of Quebec. I work as a research and innovation attaché. Also, one good thing is it gives me the opportunity to contribute to bringing Quebec and Canada and Korea closer together. So I think that's a great honor for me to be here. Also, as a Canadian official as well.
Right. So everyone, like, don't you just feel listening to Andrew's words like he's just perfect for our podcast? Like he's from Canada, but he's been working in Korea for such a long time, so he has that relationship to kind of talk about Frank William Schofield, and he also works kind of closely with the embassy. Actually, just to dive into it, the topic for today is Jeongdong Heroes, and today's first episode on which hero we're going to be talking about is Frank William Schofield. So, I did some research myself. Jeongdong is actually a place that no one really knows about. So we have this opportunity to bring awareness of Jeongdong and, why it's so important. For Schofield, he was British born, but he is actually Canadian, and he had studied to be a veterinarian. So it's funny how he's just an ordinary person and he ended up becoming this hero that involved a lot in giving Korea liberation from being controlled and colonized. So, we want to discuss a little bit about his story. How did this gentleman from the 1800s end up in Korea and ended up being a huge contributor to Korean history? So can you give us a little bit more background on, about Schofield?
Sure, it'll be my honor. Actually, in Canada, I did learn a little bit about Korean history, and Canada has a great program where they kind of introduce what Canadians have done abroad, and especially for the Korean War and that kind of stuff. So I did get a glimpse of what he did in Canada, and also I did some studies here. So just to give you a background on Frank William Schofield, he was born actually in England. Although he is Canadian, he was born in England, Warwickshire, on March 15th, 1889. And this is quite interesting because, as you can see from me as well, I am a Canadian citizen, but I was actually born in Korea. So I was born here. I left when I was 5 to immigrate to, be more specific, Quebec. So I could kind of see, I know I'm kind of pushing it, but I have some kind of relation to Frank because he, contrary to being a Canadian, he was actually born in England. As myself as well. So that's kind of a small connecting kind
Definitely.
of, although he was born he's a much older gentleman than I am. So
A couple centuries from a different country where you were born to another one. So I can't imagine Schofield being in the 1800s doing the same thing. Easier, more difficult, we're not really sure, but definitely that process is not easy no matter what century.
That's true. Frank Schofield actually graduated from the University of Toronto, or to be more specific, the Ontario Veterinary College. So technically, he is kind of my alumni, right?
I really guess. Like that because he's in Korean, right? Sunday.
Yes,
so he's
yes.
your, a couple centuries old Sunday.
Yes.
So that's another full circle that's kind of hilarious, I think.
Yes, but technically, to be honest, yes, back then the Ontario Veterinary College was part of the U of T campus or the administration system, but technically it kind of moved from U of T to another university in Ontario called Guelph, a couple in the 70s. But technically back then it was Toronto,
Right.
so I guess I am its alumni. So I kind of feel
Sunbae
honored.
Hubei
Yes, so
relationship
definitely,
there, and
yes.
you're talking about your Sunbae.
Oh, yes. And then from there, he went on to teach bacteriology and pathology. I guess it's kind of immunology at the Ontario Veterinary College after he graduated in 1910. So after he graduated, he got a teaching position. He kind of used his skills to kind of inspire the next generation of pathologists or veterinarians. That was quite cool of the service that he already did in Canada before he came to Korea. So, and then he eventually wed a young pianist named Alice in 1913 and made their way to Korea as not veterinarians but missionaries in 1916, as he was invited to teach at the Severance Union Medical College in Seoul. So I guess that's kind of the beginning of how he got to come to Korea, and he did his missionary work here.
Just to get a little bit more in-depth understanding of who he is, and I'd like to get into a little bit more about, how did he end up going to Korea? What's the start of his life when he kind of started this journey going to Korea? Yeah, obviously, he didn't set his mind or his foot to do all these heroic actions that we're going to be talking about. So it's definitely good to talk about what he started with and then how that became into what he ended up doing.
Okay, so yes, as you mentioned, he did come to Korea as a missionary, but back then missionaries, depending on the church and the countries, but the thing is, for missionaries, their main objective is spreading Christianity, love, this kind of stuff. So back in those days, I'm sure everybody knows in Korea, probably better than us, there was the Japanese colonial period. Right. So for missionaries to come to Korea, it's not like they're taking a vacation or anything. And also, they had to somewhat be very vigilant, obviously, because the Japanese are still there. So many missionaries, they had to kind of have this kind of neutral kind of mindset. Yeah, spread love and Christianity, but not like be too political or too kind of too outspoken about the colonial rule or these kind of things. Because if you think about it, if they do that, they might get kicked out or they won't have the opportunity to actually spread love of Jesus. So many had to kind of, I guess, kind of
a
toe
middle
the
ground.
line. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Like I'm not with them 100%. I'm not with you 100%. I'm just in the middle. I have to have this fine line of not getting in trouble, but I still got to do what I got to do.
Yes.
That's tough, especially when you're not that nationality of that country. You also stick out like a sore thumb. You're Caucasian. Like it's not an easy life. So he definitely had to think a lot about moving there.
And that's what made Frank even more of a hero and unique, because unlike other missionaries who really tried to, keep the neutrality for good reasons, obviously, so that they could actually do their work and not be kicked out or arrested, he actually went beyond just, being neutral, and he expressed the shared sentiment of, we call it no neutrality for brutality, because of all the atrocities, by calling for independence of the Korean people through various channels, not just, obviously they didn't have like YouTube, so he used a lot of the English channels like newspapers, media publications like Japan Advertiser or Seoul Press back in those days. So he wasn't your average, I'll stay neutral and just help people. He actually was very outspoken. So thanks to this, he was given direct knowledge of the March First movement, because by then people realized, he's an advocate for the freedom movement of Korea. So in 1999, there was a student called Yi Kap-sung to cover the story via photographs and for distributing of the March First movement, because they need coverage to show the international world Koreans are about independence, they want freedom, but they have this Japanese kind of colonial rule. So, and he continued this coverage in certain areas of Korea, such as Suncheon-ri and Cheom-ri, in which he photographed atrocities committed by the Japanese, such as luring people in disguise of a meeting and setting fire to their kind of the church and their shelters. So And thanks to his kind of bravery and not being neutral, and thanks to his coverage, many of the photos actually we see today in history books or online, a lot of it are from his photographs, because there weren't many other people who actually did this stuff, because it was, as you mentioned, very risky. So many of his work, yes, missionary and spreading love, but he went beyond that. And also thanks to his work at the Severance Hospital, because of his background in veterinarian and medicine and pathology, he was able to get a first-hand account of those who suffered from the occupation. Because if you're injured, you would go to the hospital and you could actually see, their kind of bruises or torture marks, these things. So he was able to photograph this and be kind of the witness to some of these difficult things. And also some of his coverage included the famous Sodimon prison, which still exists today, not as a prison, but kind of as a show or a kind of museum to express history. So he also covered this to show that there was a lot of inhumane treatment and torture that was being propagated by the occupiers back then. And luckily now, yes, it's being used for educational purpose. So it's actually pretty cool that, a lot of the work he did back in the decades, I wasn't even born, but he made a huge impact.
The photos that you're talking about, we don't have them in front of us, but we wanted to show you later, or if you can look it up. It's crazy, right?
Oh, yes.
To capture those kind of moments at that hard time, first of all, it's not easy. And second of all, the Japanese didn't want this to spread at all, right? So to be able to take a photo, cameras back then is not like on your cell phone. Those things are not easy to carry around. He's Caucasian. He was also handicapped. Like, he had so many things going against him. And, people, there were riots, basically, massacres, riots. So to be able to kind of sneak those photos in, make those photos become history, this is like years ago, and we still reference them now. So, if we are showing this to you, we hope this pops up on the video so you can see or check out these photos. They're really a moment of history that cannot be forgotten.
Yes, definitely. And to kind of continue on this, so he veterinarian, came as a missionary. We talked about this a bit, but after seeing all these kind of atrocities, that was his turning point, we could kind of say. And he realized, yes, I'm here to spread love, but I gotta, to spread love, his way is to cover this and show the world, there are a lot of difficulties, so have the international community kind of help out as well. Now, that is kind of the ultimate form of love and turning point.
Awesome. So, actually, when we're talking about the actions, like we were talking about the photos that Schofield had taken, one of the huge major historical events that happened in Korea was the March 1st movement, right? And, that was when Korea was fighting for independence from Japan. And Schofield just had felt that, he had the same sentiments with Koreans. He wasn't Korean himself, but he had this patriotic feeling with Korea. And like I said before, he had so many things going for him, against him, right? But he still brought this movement to the world, Let's talk a little bit more about the March 1st movement.
Sure, I'll give you a quick background. Although Koreans, I'm sure they know about this very well. They learn in their history books, whatnot. So the March 1st movement, or in Korean it's known as the Samil movement because of the numbers, was a protest held obviously on March 1st, 1919, calling for independence from Japan and a protest against forced assimilation and oppression by the Japanese. And what's interesting is this has a kind of an international background because, yes, they wanted to do this because they kept, it kind of built up all that atrocity, but it was kind of inspired by a figure, well-known figure, the President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. And those 14 points outline many things, but especially they talk about the right to self-determination. As in a certain ethnic group or nations, they have the right to kind of set their own goals, not occupied by another ethnicity or country. And 33 Korean cultural and religious leaders issued a proclamation and read out loud the Korean Declaration of Independence, which was, as I mentioned, inspired by Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which is actually quite interesting. And numerous demonstrations were held throughout Korea. such as the Pagoda Park in Seoul, which is actually located in the Gangwon Jongno area. It's a very historical place, still exists today. And this included approximately 2 million Koreans, and there were more than 1,500 demonstrations all across the country. And the bloody history of the Korean independence movement by Park Geun-sik claimed that many people were killed, wounded, and arrested. And one of the key outcomes of this March 1st movement was the establishment of the provisional government of the Republic of Korea, not in Korea because of the occupation, but actually in Shanghai in April 1919, as many were forced into exile. And as previously mentioned, Frank was one of the only foreigners who was able to actually, participate, document, and photograph many of these atrocities that occurred in and after the March 1st movement. But yet, due to his outright coverage, he, like you mentioned, he kind of stuck out like a sore thumb, because of his coverage of all those things, he was actually forced to be recalled back to Canada because, he was a missionary. There's some issues. Although the official reason was due to his wife giving birth to his son back in 1917, as well as her deteriorating mental health. So that was the official reason. But if you really think about it, after doing all those things, eventually the Japanese probably found out and they kind of put some pressure. So he was officially summoned to Canada in January 1920 and stayed in Canada until he was invited by also another famous figure, Seungman Rhee, or Lee Seungman, in 1958. Lee Seungman was the president of Korea back in those days. So he was actually invited by the highest figure in Korea, which was a big honor. So, and some of his grand achievements after returning, when he was summoned by President Rhee, was he taught at SNU, the most prestigious university in Korea, Seoul National University. Although Yonsei is good too, of course.
Yonsei's number two,
yes.
right?
And his work with orphanages, taking care of children. And ultimately, he was, because of his, historic work, he was awarded the Republic of Korea Medal of National Foundation in 1968, which is one of the highest honors, given by the country. And of course, no one lives forever. So he passed away in 1970, and he was actually buried in the Korean National Cemetery in the Patriot section. And he was actually the first foreigner to do so, and he asked for this. So, yes, it's actually quite he has a long history of serving the Korean people.
It just sounds like he's Korean, right?
Yes,
like
yes.
He's Korean. He's not Canadian. He's not from England. He did something that was it's not normal, right? For what he did and his background and stuff. His accomplishments. Not only after he got kicked out from Korea, technically, right? But, he had to be with his family. But he came back. Yes. Like, that's also not normal. Like, he came back to continue to spread education and philanthropy. Like, he definitely had a very strong bond after coming to Korea in the beginning up until he left and then come back again. And then eventually being buried here is very, he's not a normal guy.
No,
he's very special,
normal.
right?
Very special, very inspirational.
Very inspirational. So that was really interesting to hear about, he did so many things, but we actually just kind of condensed everything, right, on what he did, how he did it, and what he ended up doing after Korea, going back to Canada, then Korea again, and ended up just staying in Korea for the rest of his life until his death. So if we were to move on, his outlook, his passion for bringing awareness of those actions, it can't be ignored. He's, like I said, not normal. And that's kind of why we want to bring awareness of Jeongdong and, where he came from and what he has been doing and how it relates to now, even currently, right? His values were very important, and we still talk about him now.
Yes, that's the big thing. I mean, 50 years kind of, passed after his death, but, he still talked about these days. We're talking about him now.
Yeah.
There's books about him. Also in the Canadian Embassy, it's actually in Jeongdong.
Yeah.
And there's on the first floor, there's kind of this big kind of hall, this meeting area, and they dedicated this after him, and we call it Schofield Hall.
Have you
Yes.
been to it recently?
Oh, yes.
I want to go, but they
Okay.
won't let me in because
Yes.
we've been studying about him for so long. I'm like, okay, I need to see, the place where they kind of honor him and stuff, and see his like plaques and stuff. But they're like, no Americans allowed.
Yes.
Maybe not Americans, but just no one's allowed.
Yeah, it's Corona. Unless you have some
All right.
official business. But if you had a Canadian passport, you need to renew it, then you could go. But
Are
even
you
if you're,
sure? Will
yes,
they
but
let
even
you
if you're a
in?
Canadian and you're just like, I just want to check out the place, they won't let you in anymore
see,
because of the Corona situation.
So-
then there's like even a library in the basement of the embassy.
See, if I'm there, it'll even inspire me more. That's what I'm
exactly,
thinking.
yes.
Hopefully, the Canadian Embassy later will allow some visitors to normally visit without
Yes.
having some special connections. We didn't talk about anything like this, but yeah,
No,
hopefully.
but it's good that you want to learn more. That's
Definitely.
amazing. Yes, and also besides the Canadian embassy here, for example, a statue was erected in his honor, not in Korea, but at the Toronto Zoo. Obviously, because of his relation with the
veterinarian background.
veterinarian
I see.
college. So, and there was also a scholarship dedicated to him at the Ontario Veterinary College to having the Canadian embassy naming a hall after him that I mentioned. He was different, especially during his time, now too, but especially going beyond the call of duty, as I mentioned, because missionaries generally have to stay neutral, because if they don't, they'll get kicked out.
Exactly.
And it's good to stay neutral and still stay there and try to help. So that was kind of quite interesting. So he kind of defied the churches to stay neutral, but that is the reason why he's so famous, and that is why he did a lot of good work. And and although other missionaries at this time covered and talked about some of the atrocities, here and there, but they're still careful. But Frank was one of the only few that directly and outwardly spoke out on some of these atrocities and issues surrounding Japan's colonization of Korea, including publishing pieces to engaging with government. Not just the Canadian one, but also the British because of his background, and kind of telling them, hey, you should cover this, kind of stop this
I
kind of
think
thing.
The good thing for that is because, at that time, a lot of the countries spoke English, right? And at that time, he had studied a bit of Korean and was able to translate all those transcripts and be able to spread that. So definitely a rarity. Not some people did that, but he really put the effort into doing that.
Yes,
It's
and
very
imagine
important.
all the network that he created with all the independent, freedom fighters, all
yeah.
those people, and how much they trusted him.
Exactly.
That kind of shows, Koreans and Canada.
That's very
yes,
true.
It's quite
He
true.
could have been bought by the Japanese, to be
Exactly.
honest. Like,
Exactly.
even the Japanese kind of created the Koreans to thinking they were Japanese. So, in this way, the Japanese could have bought him and say, hey, tell us your secrets of, what's going on. But he definitely is a good person,
Yes,
and he did not
definitely.
do that.
And also, he continues to publish pieces in not just British, but Canadian media outlets, such as the Globe and Mail, regarding Japan's brutal occupation of Korea. What's interesting here is if you go to any Canadian and say Globe and Mail, they'll know. It's one of the most prestigious but famous media outlets, newspaper
Wow,
prints.
okay.
Yes, it still exists today. Yes. And obviously, it's one of those... it's kind of the New York Times for Canada, one could
Right.
kind of argue. So he
Yeah.
published there and it still exists today. That's really cool. Another noteworthy accomplishment that stood out is his meeting with Japanese counterparts. Because, yes, he covered the Japanese atrocity, but he was still able to have the prestigious, network and connections to be able to meet Japanese people, such as the Japanese Prime Minister Harake and Governor General Admiral Saito Makoto, to boldly not just say, I like you, but actually talk about the atrocity to their face, which
The
is actually...
issues that are very
yes.
sensitive to talk
Yes.
about, especially between those two countries. He was trying to play someone in the middle to kind of bring awareness on, what had happened, why did it happen, how did it happen, and kind of bring a bridge closer onto, you can't solve something like that huge, but, at least talking about it is the first step. And I think
yes.
he definitely brought that up.
And what's really interesting is if you're a Korean back then fighting for Korean freedom, it's a great thing. But I mean, one could say yes because you're Korean,
Right.
but he's not Korean.
Exactly, yeah.
And maybe he might have some lineage, but from what we know, he didn't have a Korean background back then. But he still, wanted to really dedicate his life and passion to help helped the Korean independence movement like no other. So that was very interesting.
And it's interesting, during that time he did a lot, but then even after, right, continued, as you said, addressing those things. He didn't have to do that. He could live a comfortable life, educating people at SNU. He probably had enough money, whatever, to live very comfortable lifestyle, but continued to work to bring, addressing those things afterwards. So.
And also because of heroes like him, I mean, look at Korea now. I mean, Korea's kind of somewhat at the center stage of, the global kind of trend these days. If you think about like BTS, for example,
definitely.
Who doesn't know BTS around the world?
Korea's definitely becoming more prominent worldwide.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And it's all thanks to the people like him who helped Korea, kind of become who it is today.
Exactly.
I mentioned K-pop, but there's so many other things like Samsung, semiconductors, technology, 5G, export-led growth, all that stuff. I mean, Korea is at the forefront in many of these kind of fields.
Back then, the decade ago, the subway and the phone, from then, right? The technology until now, yeah, definitely a long way. But even then, they had very advanced technology.
So, I mean, if he could hear, or see Korea today, he should be very proud.
Yeah, he definitely contributed to bringing that now. So, wow, that was so interesting to talk about Schofield, right? And then from his beginnings before Korea, being a British-born Canadian citizen, to just being a regular Joe, kind of, right? Very smart regular Joe, veterinarian. And then eventually going to Korea as a missionary with no really big goal, right? He just wants to spread Christianity. And then things just happen to him, like us with Corona. Things happen to us. Yes. Things happen to him where, he was put in a situation, witnessing, the humanity being just kind of like stripped down. It was terrible, and brought him to bring up those actions. And, thank you, Andrew, for joining us today and discussing about Schofield's accomplishments and how he is actually current now into what Korea is. Right? He definitely was one of the people that contributed to the advanced technologies and bringing Korea into a bigger prominent role in the world. So, as we close out on our first episode, again, I want to thank you, Andrew, for joining us today. We're so lucky to have you and, giving us some of your time. And want everyone to enjoy this recommended song that we have and either have a great evening, a great day, or a great night. So we'll see you on the next episode of the Jeongdong Heroes podcast. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor.